Professor Corda, a friend and colleague of Indiana Jones, flies his plane straight into a hurricane over the Bolivian rainforest on his way to an expedition. Shortly before he is forced to land, he makes a sensational discovery, a huge valley which seems to be covered in pure gold. In order to solve the secret of this meteor crater, he needs the help of Indiana Jones. Indy quickly comes to the conclusion that Corda has encountered the incredible gold treasure of El Dorado. But on this gold lies a curse. Anyone who comes into contact with it gets sick and in the end dies a painful death. But of course, this does not scare Indiana Jones in Indiana Jones and the Gold of El Dorado.
Hello and welcome back to this damnfully dualistic crusade. In this video, I'll be discussing and reviewing the third of the Wolfgang Holbein German-language Indiana Jones novels from the 1990s. This is 1991's Indiana Jones and the Gold of El Dorado. I'm reading this in another of the wonderful fan translations made freely available by Indy fans, so anyone can read these for free as they've never been officially made available as English translated versions, and these are merely fan efforts translating the very difficult to obtain German-language originals, which were never released here and never really supported by Lucasfilm, even though these are officially licensed books. Now, this story has a lot of the same sort of themes and overall style as what I talked about in the first two books, and again, it's a fan translation, so you do always have to keep in mind that sometimes the language doesn't necessarily always translate in the most fluid way, and also the translations were done at different times by different fans using different methods, and so some are directly translated from the original German, some use online translators, and some are multiple people. So it's very much a group effort, but for the most part, most of these translations are really well done. This one in particular, I only noticed a few little typos here and there, nothing major or anything that you aren't able to sort of suss out as you're reading, but I did notice that in comparison to the others I've read so far that were done by a different person who I think translated directly from the original text in German. So you're going to run into some variation with these, which is why I wanted to mention that. But again, nothing that really supremely detracts from the reading experience, and it's still an incredible gift to be able to finally read these stories, as there's great indie material here. And thankfully, I can say that Gold of El Dorado, the third book, is a gigantic improvement over the second book, Longship of the Gods, which, as I described in my review of that book, went off the deep end so hard, so fast that I really didn't enjoy the second half of that book at all. Particularly the ending was just mind-bogglingly crazy. So much so that it started reminding me of the Martin Caidin novels that are terrible from the Bantam series. Again, it should be stressed that the German novels Holbein wrote are before the Bantam series was even created, and so when these books were being written, all we had were the three films, the Marvel comics of the 80s, and the three novelizations. And Holbein was writing these indie stories at a pretty quick turnaround, as Gold of El Dorado was also released in 1991, and while it shares a lot of similarities with some of the structure of the first two books and a few other odds and ends, I not only thought this had more enjoyable aspects than the first two, which did both have enjoyable things, and a nice handle on Indy's character and a real focus on action set pieces, which Gold of El Dorado does too, but here I think there's more characterization. There's nothing that ventures into the full-bore craziness of the second book, Longship of the Gods. And of the three books so far, I think this is the most consistently well-written and the most engaging overall. So it was a really pleasant surprise to enjoy this book from start to finish compared to struggling through Longship of the Gods and having flashbacks to the Martin Caidin indie novels, which nobody needs that. Nobody needs to be reminded of Indiana Jones and the Sky Pirates when you're reading anything. But Gold of El Dorado, to talk a little bit about the plot and to try and avoid spoilers. The basic translated blurb that you find on the Indiana Jones wiki page does actually give away quite a bit of the plot, but that's actually in the sort of opening setup sequence, so it's not really giving anything away. Like the first two books, we start with a sequence that is setting up the story. The reader quickly realizes this is a moment that's action in progress, and like the second book, it doesn't feature feature Indiana Jones at all. But thankfully, this is a nice self-contained sequence where the fellow archaeologist from Indy's college, as we later find out, Stanley Korda, who is a not very trustworthy archaeologist who prefers to contribute more to his self-worth in terms of financial gain, basically the sort of dark reflection of what Indiana Jones could be, is struggling to get his plane through a hurricane storm raging over somewhere in South America and barely manages to survive a plane crash. But he crashes in a remote area that just so happens to feature everything in sight covered in gold. So that's a very arresting opening, and it nicely is self-contained, so it doesn't go on for too long. It hooks the reader's interest immediately, but the problem is it does take quite a while to get back to that, and because we know about the discovery of everything covered in gold, we know quite a bit more than the other characters do for a significant amount of time in the book. So that can get a little bit frustrating that it seems to take the characters a while to catch up to where the reader is. It does give a good deal of suspense, though, and thankfully isn't anywhere near as bad as this issue was in Longship of the Gods. But the first act of the book revolves around Indiana Jones teaching at college, and the setting or year given is 1943 in the book, but the actual sort of Indy chronology kind of wants to put this more like happening in 1941 or so. Essentially, this is taking place sometime during the World War II years and the situation heating up much more in Europe. Indy is teaching at college and has some nice sort of run-ins with the upper management who, shall we say, are not very fond of his methodology or disappearing all the time and going off on quests and things. And he sort of only has Marcus Brody to confide in, but this is still taking place technically after Last Crusade, and Indy's sort of trying to figure out his place in the world while still teaching classes and figuring out what to do during the war years. He's quickly made aware that his fellow archaeologist that he doesn't really have a high reputation of, Dr. Stanley Korda, who we saw have that experience in the opening cold open sequence, has disappeared for mysterious reasons, and his wife, who Indy has always been very fond of and has always been a sort of potential love interest, old flame of sorts, is very much concerned, but also is being followed around by not just one, but several parties of men with seemingly dangerous intentions against her, wanting something that her husband either had or know his whereabouts or find out what he's up to. The reader can very quickly suss out that Dr. Korda, especially when Indy talks about how he's known for years that Korda kind of is just selling stuff on the black market that he finds on archaeological expeditions and doesn't really care about archaeology. We can tell what sort of guy this is, and that he must be going after the sort of gold-encrusted kingdom he stumbled onto somewhere in South America. We then go through, honestly, it's extended, but it's actually a quite nicely laid out Indy sort of playing detective on his hometown and college campus grounds. So it does have that sort of flavor we get of the campus scenes, and then Indy in his office and being grabbed by Donovan's goons, and his father's house being ransacked and talking to Brody. It has all of that flavor from those scenes in Last Crusade, but nicely sort of spread out. It probably goes on for quite a bit too long, I would argue, but it has a nice flavor of Indy doing detective work and trying to help a friend who he kind of also has romantic feelings for, and also calling in Marcus Brody for help when it becomes also a question of archaeology, and having several quite nicely done action set pieces, first with a couple of goons who are later revealed as FBI agents, much to Indy's chagrin. That's a nicely done little sequence, and those characters become recurring characters for the rest of the book, but also a group of agents, one of whom is a seemingly invulnerable giant, so I guess Holbein loves that trope a lot because he uses some form of that in every book so far, but these are the real henchmen of the villain Ramos, who is revealed to be a sort of super arch criminal with fingers in every nefarious criminal pie that the FBI and other law enforcement agencies have been after for years. And he's had dealings with Dr. Korda selling various priceless treasures and wants Corda for his own nefarious means, and is willing to kill anyone or do away with anything that would get in his way. Again, there are some really nice action set pieces. The big one in particular takes place in the Corda's house, where Indy has to save Marion Corda. No relation to Marion Ravenwood, of course, but here you have another Indy love interest named Marion. But basically, the whole house gets torn apart, and it reminds me of the nice action sequence in A View to a Kill, where Bond has to defend Stacy Sutton in the Sutton home, which gets basically torn up, and there's also a fight on the staircase in this bigger sort of historical home. That's what it makes me think of. In fact, the whole opening does have that sort of flavor of the more somber and slower, methodically paced sections in A View to a Kill, so I don't know if that was an influence on Holbein writing this, but in any case, the whole first act is basically taking place on Indy's home turf, and then we get introduced to Ramos specifically, who actually captures both Marion and Marcus Brody, essentially holding them hostage to force Indy to go to South America to essentially track down the missing Dr. Corda on his own to facilitate the release, hopefully, of both Marion Corda and Marcus Brody. He's then followed by the FBI agents, who are not very pleased being stuck with who they essentially view as a civilian. But once they get to South America, the book does nicely play around with the fact that none of them have jurisdiction and their FBI badges are practically worthless because they're on foreign soil. The reader can see where this is kind of going, and unfortunately the book kind of goes in fits and spurts in terms of the pacing. The whole first act is nice, but it also goes on for a substantial amount of time in terms of the page count, and it also has moments where we could have easily gone ahead and transitioned to the sort of journey, the hunt for Dr. Corda to hopefully obtain the release of Indy's kidnapped friends. But we then have further beats, and Indy actually meets the villain Ramos face to face, who is actually revealed to be blind, which gives him a nice sort of unique super villain aspect. He seems to have not only greater powers of extrasensory perception, his disability doesn't stop his extremely cunning mind. But the way that sequence is staged, the villain could have very easily been caught there had it not been a particular plot contrivance to have him get away and keep the book going, and Indy almost manages to save both of his friends, but only saves one. It seemed like an odd fit, and I felt the book would have been better had we sort of skipped the action parts of that and just gotten to what is technically the second act. But then the second act becomes more of a sort of trek into the jungle as Indy and the FBI agents and Marion Corda move further on the trail of trying to find her missing husband, who has very obviously gotten a sort of crew together of different people he's paid off and is trying to find the sort of lost area of gold that he stumbled upon. It does take quite a while for all of the pieces of what the actual plot is to be revealed to all of our characters, Indy most of all. So the reader is once again, as we saw in the past two books, very much many steps ahead of a lot of the characters. And just like in the first two books, Indy is very much kept in the dark for quite a while, and a lot of the other characters seem to know far more about what's going on than Indy does. Thankfully, it's not as obtrusive or annoying as the first two books, and the actual plot twists are much better executed, and there's quite a number of them, including the final one, which is very nicely done, and in such a good way that it makes the entire action of the book make sense. As they move further into the jungle, Indy and his companions are constantly having a sort of back and forth, and we realize that we don't necessarily know where everyone's allegiances are really aligned. Also, there are encounters with a local tribe who has been attacked by the various forces, first of Corda's group and then of the absolutely ruthless group of mercenaries led by Ramos, who of course is also there in the jungle. So you essentially have two parties duking it out back and forth in a game of constant cat and mouse with an ever piling up body count as they try to find the first party of Dr. Corda that that is several days ahead of them in the jungle, and both parties eventually know for sure that they're trying to also find this lost city of gold, which does seemingly have a sort of curse tied to it. And this is also tied into the FBI agents making several allusions early in the book, and Indy being led into the fact that the other reason they're sort of on this quest is it is somehow tied to the very much top secret Manhattan Project, which was, of course, the development of the atomic bomb. And it becomes very quickly apparent to the reader that the gold that's also been spirited out a little bit by Dr. Corda in small pieces that has made certain people sick, and it being linked to the Manhattan Project very much indicates that perhaps at least some of this treasure is somehow irradiated. So again, the reader is still several steps ahead as we see Indy and his companions have a back and forth battle of wills between their forces and the forces of the villain Ramos. Indy gets caught at several points and has to make daring escapes. There are a number of extended action set pieces, once again, that are really nice and cinematic. If some are maybe a little bit too long, that's sort of in keeping with the first two books. And then we're eventually introduced to another surviving group in the jungle who are essentially the sort of guardians of this gold city, which Indy has theorized to perhaps and very likely be the fabled lost city of El Dorado. And then it becomes a matter of, are they even allowed into the city? No, they're not. And how do they deal with this sort of secret tribe of individuals who also appear to be very inhuman in ways? And the reader can infer that if the gold is indeed radioactive somehow, that it's been essentially a group of people who have basically been mutated over many generations by simply being in proximity to irradiated gold, and the local tribespeople essentially thought that it was tied to a curse. The reason why I give a little bit more plot detail here is that in between these moments, there's essentially multiple dialogue scenes and action set pieces until we get to the next little nugget of the plot, and then finally have the end wrap up inside the city of El Dorado itself, which has a beautiful full reveal and sees essentially Indiana Jones and Marcus Brody, who is tagging along with Indy incredibly, essentially walking into certain death, which is a really nice touch in terms of dramatic staging. But the reason why I can go into some of these details more without it really feeling like a spoiler is because, again, as the reader, you're so far ahead of all the characters, especially Indy himself, because we have that opening at the start that tells us about the city of gold and how it looks like everything down to leaves on a tree is literally made out of gold. And we know that that's Dr. Corda. And then we find out about the pieces he smuggled out making people sick. And we have the FBI agents talking about the Manhattan Project. You can very quickly put two and two together in the first act of the book. And also the second act is quite short, and the third act is at least a little bit longer, but most of the book is dedicated to the whole first act on Indy's home turf and his college town, that there's not as much detail in the plotting when you get towards the climax in El Dorado, and most of the third act is taken up with action set pieces. So this does still have some of the same issues, I think, that I felt were in the first two books, but there's a lot less of them because the overall plot is better paced. It feels like a conscious improvement over the first two books, especially Longship of the Gods. Although it repeats some of the same mistakes and has some issues still there, I thought it was a far more satisfying book than the first two. It retains all the positives that I found in those, while at least addressing some of the other issues. It's not exactly perfect, nor is it as clearly plotted as I would have liked once you get to the middle of the book. But it is a satisfying read, and it is a great Indy story, and everything fits without ever going overboard into the supernatural. There's just enough of the supernatural, and when you get the full explanation, you get the historical side, you get the setting, the atmosphere, and you've got Indy and the lost city of El Dorado. I mean, what's not to love? I also enjoy the fact that there's a number of characters that you don't quite know their motivations, so that adds to the mystery flavor. I like the idea of the villain, although I don't think he's developed enough and is only in the book sporadically. I think the best aspect is the Marion Corda character and the sort of idea that she's the wife of a guy that Indy really can't stand, who's very much in the Belloc mold and somebody who is basically the dark reflection of what Indy could be. Plus, he's also a professor who somehow has tons of money to throw around. Basically, he does everything that Indy's moral code refuses to let him do, which is why Indy hates his guts. He's also a bit of a douchebag, but and he also treats his wife terribly. And all of this plays in to the character relationships, and Indy's had to sort of carried a torch for Marion all these years, but always been gentlemanly about it, and is that also gives him an extra sense of guilt that he doesn't quite know what to do or how to help her, but he wants to be a friend. So it's a nice dynamic that we haven't seen in an Indy story to this point, or frankly in the Bantam novels. So for me, the most rewarding part of this book was Indy's characterization and the relationship with the Marion Corda character. And the finale of the book is beautifully done. So while I have a lot of issues with some of the plotting, and particularly the second and third act, I absolutely adored the climax. The climax was perfectly executed. It was a perfect fitting end to the character arcs for Indy and the Marion character. And even Marcus Brody gets to be there and be much more like the Marcus of Raiders and not the sort of buffoonish Marcus of Last Crusade. And anytime you get that, I'm very happy, because I never liked what Last Crusade did to both Brody and Sala, and trying to make them more of clownish characters for comic relief. So ultimately, I really enjoyed the opening and the ending of Gold of El Dorado most of all. I thought it was a very satisfying Indy story. While maybe not a perfect read, it's the most engaging of these German novels so far, and actually I think the best written, even though the translation does have a few typos here and there as compared to the translations of the first two books. Again, nothing major, nothing that takes you out of the story, but it just kind of underlines how the books have been translated by different people using different methods. And again, my hat's off to all the wonderful Indy fans who did this just so the rest of us Indy nerds could finally read the German novels. And this one was so enjoyable that I think it's a real shame that these have never been officially released in the English language. While it's not perfect, I think this is still a really satisfying Indy story, and frankly, it's better than some of the Bantam novels. But, I mean, anything's better than the Caden books that I've read in Indy so far. Even Longship of the Gods, as crazy as that was better than the two Martin Caden Indy novels. But I would actually say Gold of El Dorado is, if I'm doing a ranking, I would say that this is at least getting up there, maybe around the halfway mark if I'm ranking the Bantam and German novels so far. It is a really satisfying Indy story, and I would recommend this to any Indy fan, because you get some really nice action set pieces. The tone is spot on. It feels like the Indy of the films. The setting is great. There is some freshness to the characterizations, particularly the idea of the love interest and the whole setup there. We've got Indy in the lost city of El Dorado, which may be irradiated gold. That in and of itself is an irresistible plot idea, I think. So if any of this sounds interesting, you're going to have a blast with this book. And you can now thankfully read it in a beautiful fan translation. So since you can read this for free, I would encourage all Indy fans to check it out. If what I described about the first two books maybe doesn't really sound like your thing, I would say at least definitely read this. And I'm really hoping the rest of these books continue with this sort of upward swing, as I thought Longship of the Gods was just so crazy and oddly plotted and poorly structured that it was a disappointment after the first book. but I didn't think the first book was perfect either. I enjoyed Feathered Serpent for aspects, but I thought it was a bit problematic. So it was really nice to get this novel, Gold of El Dorado, and it really show that the author is working on this as a series and trying to polish it and continually make things better. Lastly, I would mention that while I think the plotting is better and the pacing is better, and I like the sort of relaxed pacing of the opening with Indy sort of being a detective on his own in his own hometown, this book still is not without the overall pacing problems of the Holbein novels so far. You still have the very odd chapter structuring where some chapters are exceptionally long and some are very short, but it's at least not as jarring as the first two books. So again, I think in all areas you can see that this has gotten better. It's an improvement. Also, there are some elements that are kind of repeated. The big one is that there's once again a henchman who's described as being literally a giant who is seemingly unstoppable, and this culminates in several fights, but the big one being where Indy, the two FBI agents, others who are already in a sort of Mexican standoff with guns pointed, and even the snooty dean of the college who is useless, getting involved with a giant altercation in the college office with this giant henchman, and they're all like Indy's hanging on his back, and like this giant is able to fight like 5 or 6 guys and is seemingly unstoppable. It's like, yes, that's amusing, but is every book going to have a fight with a seemingly invulnerable giant henchman? Because there's been some form of that in all 3 books so far, but at least this one, it felt a bit more fitting with the plot. And while that sequence does go on for quite a while, it doesn't go on as long as the elevator hotel fight between Indy and a giant henchman in Feathered Serpent, which went on for like an entire chapter or longer. So if you read these books in order, you'll notice there are some themes and elements that echo and appear in each book. So it's obviously part of a series, but I was just really thoroughly pleased that this book was an improvement and such a change of pace after Longship of the Gods, which was frankly a book that I did not enjoy reading, whereas this book I truly did. Now, to talk about the cover artwork, the original paperback from Goldman in Germany is done in the same uniform style, so all of the books have nice painted covers with an artist version of a famous Harrison Ford Indy still from the original trilogy, with some sort of setting on the bottom to represent a core location from the story, and a sort of nice color background. So here we have a nice painting of a Temple of Doom Indy still with a sort of a basic artist rendering of the golden paradise city of El Dorado, complete with waterfall and sort of jungle vegetation, but with a nice golden glow because all of this is covered in gold in the story. So it's a really nicely done cover, and the sort of gold is blended into a sort of greenish effect that's going into what looks like just a shot of the sky behind Indy. So it's like Indy's head is floating in a sort of landscape picture of the lost city of El Dorado. I really like this cover. I think it's really well done. It's very effective, and it gives you a perfect rendering for El Dorado as it's described in the book. So it's really nicely done. It's attention grabbing, and it's also part of the same uniform design of this series. So all the books have a cover like this, but so far I think this is the best of the covers of the 3 books I've read. So those are my overall thoughts on the fan translation of the 3rd Wolfgang Holbein German Indiana Jones novel, Indiana Jones and the Gold of El Dorado from 1991. I think this is a really well done indie adventure. I think it has the flavor of the 3 films. I think it has all the positives of the first 2 books and manages to fix some of my many issues with them. So this is easily the best of the 3 so far, which is good because Longship of the Gods was so off-putting, it would make, I think, most indie fans reconsider finishing the series. So if that book throws you off, stick with it because this 3rd book is a dramatic improvement. It's not perfect. I do still have issues with it, but overall, it is a satisfying indie adventure. I think that climax works so well that it manages to overcome a lot of the issues I had with the book in terms of the second and third act. So it is a satisfying indie adventure, if imperfect, and I would recommend it to all indie fans. So I will leave links in the description below so you can take a look at these lovely fan translations. Again, thank you so much to all of the fans who contributed to these and made these freely available so all of us non-German speakers can actually enjoy these works and examine them as fellow indie nerds. So as always, I hope my babbles about our favorite archaeologist hero have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I know this is a work of fan translation and obviously not official, but it's just a wonderful treasure to be able to finally look at these and have some other indie adventures that before this point were really unknown to us who couldn't speak German, and then also track down German paperbacks from 1991 that obviously were going to cost quite a bit on the used market now, and then import them to the US. So again, many thanks to the fans behind this translation project, and it's amazing that we're able to read these. So definitely check these out, as they are freely available and should remain so, because these are not for profit. They are merely for preservation purposes. As always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some nice indie books, whether it be the Bantam novels or the young indie books, because your indie bookstores need all the help and support they can get. And unfortunately, indie in print media is long out of print and not really supported by publishers in the US. So definitely keep reading, keep cracking the whip, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.